My name is Peter Hine. I'm the president of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York. Welcome to our Constitution Week meeting. The United States Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787. It's a momentous event that we commemorate this week. We will start with the invocation by our chaplain, Father Cullen. Father Cullen.
Whenever I hear about the United States Constitution, I think of that extraordinary room in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. I feel like it's hallowed ground because it's such an amazing founding that they came together and discussed and debated in that particular room in a particular summer. Let us pray. Lord of nations and all provident Father, we gather together to remember the Constitution of the United States. As we recall this great work, render our hearts grateful for the sacrifices of those who have gone before us. Bless our commemoration, and may it serve to remind us of the mysterious providence by which you oversaw the founding of this great republic, a republic in which the people, we the people, are sovereign. Grant us a renewed dedication to this fundamental belief. Today, we commend to you the countless patriots of this republic who have down the ages and across the generations sacrificed for this republic. Bless us here present and all the friends of liberty. With a love for the republic, we ask all this in thy holy name. Amen.
Amen. Next, I'm going to call on our registrar, Scott Jeffrey, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
And if everyone can turn around, I think that would be the, we have a plethora of flags, and I think that would be the best. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Scott. The Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York was formed in 1883 by grandchildren of those who, through military or civil service, achieved American independence during the Revolutionary War. We seek to memorialize and commemorate the memory of those patriots. Just a minute on upcoming events. We have calendars posted on the Fraunces Tavern Museum website and the Sons of the Revolution in the State of New York website for a full listing. But I'd like to flag in particular that this Friday, September 20th, we will have our annual Nathan Hale Day commemoration. We commemorate this great patriot who was hung on September 22, 1776, in front of the statue of Nathan Hale that our society donated to the city of New York over 100 years ago. It stands in City Hall Park. So just enter the secured plaza area at City Hall Park and join us at noon. On Wednesday, October 23, we will be opening an enlarged version of our Birch Trials exhibit. So the Birch Trial exhibit, which had been in the small area behind me, has been moved to a larger area in the 54 Pearl building. We're going to open that on October 23, invite all of you to join. On Evacuation Day, November 25, we will be having our annual Evacuation Day dinner here at Fraunces Tavern. We'll be replicating the 13 toasts that were given that evening, November 25, 1783. Earlier that day, we will be having a commemoration with the ceremonial lowering of the British flag and raising of the American flag at Evacuation Day Plaza, which is Bowling Green, just a few blocks from here. And then our Talmadge Day meeting will be January 27. Rick Brookhiser will be speaking on his new book, Glorious Lessons, John Trumbull, Painter of the American Revolution. And finally, our George Washington birthday ball will be Friday evening, February 21, 2025, at the Metropolitan Club. We will not only honor George Washington, but we will also commemorate the 250th anniversary of the creation of the nation's armed forces that occurred in 1775. And we will be presenting our Distinguished Patriot Award to General Richard Myers, retired United States Air Force General, who served as the 15th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and led our nation's response to 9/11. I'd like to briefly mention and welcome our officers who are here tonight. Peter Sherwin, our first vice president and chairman of the executive committee. Second vice president, Ray Manning. Our registrar, Scott Jeffrey. Our chaplain, Christopher Cullen. I'm also pleased that our past president, Ambrose Richardson, is here. Ambrose continues to be very active in the role of our society. He also serves as secretary of the General Society, Sons of the Revolution, and he serves as president of the Lower Manhattan Historical Association. A number of our board members are here tonight, including Alan Borst, Todd Holder, Tom Lofton, Justin Tessier, and then I also would like to recognize members of our Long Room Association here tonight, including Scott Jeffrey. I understand that there are hundreds of people on Zoom, so welcome to our Zoom audience, which includes many members from our co-sponsoring organizations. We have 5 chapters of the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Mary Washington Colonial Chapter, the Brooklyn Chapter, Fort Greene Chapter, Knickerbocker Chapter, Peter Minuet Chapter, as well as the New York State Society of Children of the American Revolution, and the first New York Continental Chapter, Sons of the American Revolution. Thank you to all of our co-sponsors, and several of the representatives of those co-sponsors have officers present tonight. My apologies if I overlook anyone, but I believe Melinda Allison, registrar of the New York State Society of the Children of the American Revolution, is here. Devin Pence, regent of the Knickerbocker chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Catherine Jackson, who's now vice regent of the Fort Greene chapter. Elizabeth Alessi, who is recording secretary of that chapter, and Jim Kaplan, who is the co-founder and chairman of the Lower Manhattan Historical Association. Tonight's event required a lot of organization. The good organizational work continues as we speak. I'd like to thank in particular Scott Dwyer, our executive director, Shelby Carr, our membership manager, and Sophia Hall, who is our development and events associate. And at this time, I'd like to call on Scott Jeffrey to present a rosette to a new member who is here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Shane Gardner, are you here? There we go. Awesome. If you could step up, please. And if you would not mind, raise your right hand and repeat after me. I declare upon honor.
I declare upon honor.
Actually, you hold this.
I declare upon honor.
That I will endeavor to promote the purposes of the institution.
That I will endeavor to promote the purposes of the institution.
Observe the Constitution and bylaws of the society.
Observe the Constitution and bylaws of the society.
And support the Constitution of the United States.
And support the Constitution of the United States.
Awesome. And thank you. And allow me to pin our rosette of the Society of the Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York. On your bell. I'm very good at it. Now I have this job. There you go. Excellent. Congratulations.
Thank you, Scott. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Tom Hand. Tom is the author of an engaging, colorful, and well-written book, An American Triumph, America's Founding Era Through the Lives of Ben Franklin, George Washington, and John Adams. Last spring, Tom's book received one of our 2 honorable mentions as part of the Fraunces Tavern Museum Book Awards. And so we're delighted, Tom, that we're able to hear from you tonight concerning your book. I might add that the book is on sale in the next room, and if you purchase a copy, I'm sure that Tom will be willing to sign it after we're over with the program. Tom is also the creator of the website Americana Corner. It shares stories about the events, documents, and leaders that help create and shape our country. And Tom is himself the author of many articles and blog postings about these matters. Tom established the Preserving America Grant Program, which supports many projects across the nation that contribute to sharing the history of the early American period, including the American Revolution. Fraunces Tavern has benefited from Americana grants, which have supported the conservation of Martha Washington's slipper and of John Mackey Falconer's painting, representing an early depiction of the house in Philadelphia where Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Working closely with Tom on his projects is Tom's wife, Shar, who is with us this evening as well. So Shar, thank you for joining us. And Tom is a graduate of West Point and has a classmate of his, Mike White, joining us this evening with Mike's wife, June. So thank you as well. Tom, among many other things, serves on the Board of Trustees of the American Battlefield Trust. And I discovered with interest that Tom and I share a Wisconsin connection. Tom founded the Gilman Cheese Corporation based on Wisconsin. I grew up in Wisconsin, and so always delighted to meet someone else from Wisconsin. So please welcome Tom Hand.
Thank you for having me tonight. Get comfortable here before we get started. Sign of my age, I can't stand the way I used to, so I have to sit down for these talks. Thank you, Peter, for having me tonight, and thank you to the Sons of the Revolution in New York State. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you to my good friends, Mike and June White. Mike and I went to Hudson High many years ago, and been friends ever since. When Peter first asked me to talk, my first question I asked him was, well, how long do you want me to talk for? And he said, oh, 30 or 40 minutes. And I thought, oh, wow, this is great. No one has ever voluntarily listened to me for that long. And so I thought, sign me up. Went to Sharon and said, you're not gonna believe this, I'm gonna be talking in New York City. And she said, oh, don't get too excited. The last time someone asked you to speak, you had 2 people show up. And so I pointed out to her that with the cameraman, it was actually 3. We were very pleased with that attendance, but anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I do like talks to be interactive. I don't do this, actually, it's the first time I've done this. So I do like talks interactive. Please feel free to ask questions, give me your comments, or cheer wildly if I say something that's inspiring, okay? I thought we would go through the history of our colonial collaboration all the way through to the Constitution. And I thought we'd do a little bit of a deeper dive into the Constitution and compare the Constitution to its predecessor, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. So please ask questions as you have them. The first effort at colonial collaboration was something called the Albany Congress. And the Albany Congress took place in Albany, New York, 1754, at the outset of the French and Indian War. 7 colonies showed up, and the idea was to figure out ways to talk with the Indian tribes so they would be on our side, and also to find measures for common defense. But a guy named Ben Franklin proposed something called the Albany Plan. And the Albany Plan was really the first time we tried organizing as a central government. He proposed a president general, a committee made up of all the colonies, and a taxation authority that would allow them to raise and fund and support an army and a navy. And that proposal, the Albany Plan, was unanimously approved by the delegates. And they were pretty confident about that, so they sent it all back to the royal governors, where it was unanimously disapproved by the governors. And as Ben Franklin pointed out, it was because they jealously guarded their states' rights, even before 1787. And I'll point out one thing. You see this join or die flag up here? It's a bit of historic trivia for you. The first political cartoon in our nation's history was a join or die cartoon made by none other than Ben Franklin. Most talented guy, I think, in our country's history, phenomenal guy. And so anytime you see cartoons about Donald or Kamala, you can trace it back to Ben Franklin. Fast forward about 11 years. And the next thing that happened was the Stamp Act Congress in response to the Stamp Act that was passed by Parliament in 1765. We pushed back on it with a declaration of grievances, but more importantly, the merchants in England pushed back on it because they didn't want trade to be restricted. And as a result, they rescinded the Stamp Act. But the same day that they rescinded the Stamp Act, they passed something called the Declaratory Act, which said, yeah, we're backing down on this one. We have the right to do it. And so you move forward about 8 years, and they passed one of those taxes, which they said they had the right to do, the Tea Act. And that was primarily done not to raise revenue, but to salvage the East India Company, who was struggling to survive against smuggled Dutch tea, not so much in America, but into England. And so they instituted the Tea Act. People in America, especially Sam Adams, didn't like it. John Hancock, they might have been smuggling tea in to the colonies. I don't know. There's no real proof of that, but people suspect that. And so they pushed back on it. And their way of pushing back was something called the Boston Tea Party. December 16, 1773, they just had a reenactment, great event. Now, interestingly, that wasn't the only Tea Party, and it wasn't the only ship that was pushed back on at that time. There were actually 7 tea ships that sailed over. 4 went to Boston Harbor, you know about that. 1 went to New York City, but couldn't get into the harbor because of weather, went back loaded with tea. 1 made it to the port of Philadelphia, but they said, you can't unload here. And so that went back, fully loaded, back to England. 1 made it to Charleston. And that one, they agreed to unload the tea, but they wouldn't let them sell it. They locked it up. And ironically, 6 years later, they sold that tea so they could help fund the war effort against England. But in 1774, a little known event called the burning of the Peggy Stewart happened. Anybody familiar with that? Yeah, most of us aren't. A guy named Anthony Stewart owned a ship. He also owned a daughter named Peggy. He named a ship after her, Peggy Stewart. And he was bringing in some indentured servants, not slaves, but indentured servants into the States, 53 of them. And they just happened to put some tea into the hold, maybe make some extra money on it, and slip it through the authorities in the States. And so it shows up in Annapolis. And it was a tough voyage. They want to get the indentured servants off the ship. And they also, but to do that, they had to pay the customs duty to get it unloaded. And the whole cargo, including the tea. Well, this guy who was a rival of Anthony's got wind of that. And he says, "Ah, not so fast, my friend." What he does is he gets the rest of the townsfolk up in arms against this guy, Anthony Stewart. And he makes him burn his ship with a tea on it. They don't just take the tea off. They make him sail it out in the middle of the harbor, apologize to everyone in Annapolis, and then torch his own ship. And that was the burning of Peggy Stewart. And so if you're looking for something fun to do next month, and you're in Annapolis or nearby, they're hosting the 250th of the burning of the Peggy Stewart next month on the Severn River. So anyway, so that, of course, the Tea Acts, and that led to the Tea Parties, and that led to something called the Coercive Acts. We call them here the Intolerable Acts. And that was where they closed the port of Boston, rescinded the Charter of Massachusetts. And of course, we had to push back on that. And that led us to what we call the First Continental Congress. And out of that, in 1774, came the first of our 4 foundational documents. It was really the first thing that we did as a collective group to say we were one, as opposed to 13. That's something called the Articles of Association. Have you guys ever heard of that? Okay. It's a big deal. We don't think of it today, but it was so important to people back in the 1800s that Abraham Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, identified the start of our union, not at the Declaration of Independence, but at the Continental Association, or the Articles of Association, that first document we signed. He said that was really the first time we came together as one. And all that really did was put a boycott on British goods. But by the time the boycott was taking effect, something called Lexington and Concord had happened. 1775, April 19th. We were just up at Lexington and Concord, weren't we, Shar? Great place to visit. And so we reassemble in Philadelphia, 1775, at the Second Continental Congress, where 2 of our other foundational documents were created. Declaration of Independence, primary author, Thomas Jefferson. He got a lot of help from other people, but he was a primary author and a great writer. And something called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. People forget about the Perpetual Union thing. And I won't go through all the articles, but I'll talk about a couple key ones so we can talk about that later on when we bring up the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation were intentionally made with a weak central government and strong on states' rights. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But it also had another clause, a perpetual union one, and we'll get back to that in just a second. A couple of things you know about the Articles of Confederation. Article 1 is where we got our name, the United States of America. Article 1 identifies that. We've had it ever since, thank the Lord. Article 2 says the states shall be sovereign and independent. Article 5 talks about one state, one vote. Doesn't matter if you're Little Rhode Island or you're Virginia, one state, one vote. Article 9 lists the delegated powers to the Confederation government, and it's very small. There's no central authority, executive, and there's no central judiciary. And then Article 13 is the important one. It says this union shall be perpetual. And interestingly, that was not included in the Constitution. And they also intentionally omitted the word expressly. We talked a little bit about Article 2, where it delegates powers, and it said that all powers are reserved to the states except those expressly delegated to the central authority. The word expressly was also intentionally left out of the Constitution. Why does that matter? We're going to talk about that. And so now we have the Articles of Confederation. We use them, exist under them during the war. and for several years after the war, and we're struggling. And so they convene what was called the Philadelphia Convention, or the Federal Convention. It wasn't called the Constitutional Convention until well into the 1800s. And so these guys come together and they create our fourth foundational document, the Constitution. And let's talk about the Constitution just a bit. The Constitution was really designed to empower a federal system which hadn't happened before. There had been confederations like in Switzerland, and there had certainly been a lot of autocratic regimes, but this was the first federal government. I'm going to grab a little drink of water here. I'm struggling with the tickle in my throat. Sorry about this. Any questions so far? Anything? Thank you. Excuse me. The Constitution, 7 articles, and an indication of how important Congress was and the executive wasn't, and the judiciary wasn't. More than half of all the words in the Constitution are in Article 1, which gives power to Congress. And in that is included a small phrase that caused a lot of mischief. Section 8 includes a term that says necessary and proper. Has anyone ever heard that term, necessary and proper? You guys know what that clause is? Any attorneys in here? You probably know, Peter? Yes. Okay. The necessary and proper clause seemed like it was innocent enough. But what it did was it said that Congress had the right, and the federal Congress had the right to pass any laws that necessary and proper to execute its enumerated powers. And what's an enumerated power? It's one that's stated. So keep that in mind until we get to 1819. We'll get there soon, don't worry. And so that's one important clause in there. And then you get to the Bill of Rights, which really was just an appendage to the Constitution. The Constitution would not have passed without the Bill of Rights. We'll talk about that in just a second also. The 10th Amendment states that all powers will be reserved to the states except those delegated to the federal authority. But the word expressly is not in there. And why is that? Any thoughts on that? Why do you think the word expressly is out of that? Peter?
Suspect someone felt that, they would potentially want a greater grant, and therefore, by taking out expressly, you could have things that were implied by other language.
Perfect. It's a perfect answer. Also cause a lot of mischief because it gives latitude. James Madison, brilliant man, recognized they couldn't think of everything. And so he put some flexibility in there, built it in. And he was smart to do that. He was showing a lot of foresight. And remember, they crafted this thing in 4 months. So he didn't really have a chance to think about this a lot, although he was a constitutional scholar. And so anyway, so that's the 10th Amendment. And you think, well, the 10th Amendment passes, and it helps get the Constitution approved. But we still weren't done because it had to be ratified. And so I had to go back to the states. This is a long journey. This was not something that was easy to do. Remember, we had 2 distinct camps of Americans who loved the country. And they had 2 distinct views of how the country should be run. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Of course, we all love a country, but how you do it, the devil's in the details, as they say. It was no different back then. One side said we couldn't have a big central government. One side we had to have it. And so they discussed it back and forth. To show you how much lack of unanimity we had at the Constitutional Convention, we had 74 delegates that were authorized to attend. Well, first of all, not all 13 states showed up. Rhode Island said, we're not having anything to do with it. Patrick Henry was probably after George Washington and Ben Franklin, the most revered man in America, said he smelt a rat. He wasn't going to show up at anything that was going to take away states' rights. And they weren't alone, those guys. The 74 delegates were appointed. Only 55 guys ever showed up. The rest of them, I'm not gonna bother with it, or I'm opposed to the whole idea. Like Patrick Henry. Only 40 guys were there most of the time, and only 38 guys signed it. 3 men who were some of the most prominent men in America, Elbridge Gerry, Edmund Randolph, and George Mason, the father of our Bill of Rights, were there in Philadelphia. They refused to sign it. That's how opposed they were. Then they took the Constitution to the different conventions. Each state held a convention to pass it. And it wasn't unanimous there either. These are people who all they knew was their colony and their state. In Pennsylvania, people were so opposed to the Constitution, the anti-federalists they were called, and they were in a minority, but they were smart enough to know that without them, they wouldn't hold a quorum. Anyone knows what a quorum is? Right? You don't have enough guys to vote, you can't vote, right? So 17 of these delegates, these anti-federalists, locked themselves up in the hotel room. And they refused to show up. So they want to take the vote. There's not a quorum, you can't take the vote, right? And so what do the nice people of Philadelphia do? Not the delegates, these are the people of Philadelphia. Anybody from Philadelphia here? All right, it's a tough town. It's a tough town, but. So what do? They go at night carrying these torches, and they go and they break down the doors of 2 delegates. They needed 2 more people for a quorum. And they drag them kicking and screaming out of their beds, and they take them to the Pennsylvania State House, plunk them down in their chairs. And the president says, okay, you got a quorum, let's vote now. And the vote was 47-2. Yes, the 2 guys in the chair voted, but. So that's how opposed they were in New York State. Believe it or not, the opposition was led by the Clintons. And no, not Hillary and Bill. They're old, but they're not that old. This was led by George and his nephew, DeWitt Clinton. Finally got voted up, but a very close vote. In Massachusetts, a guy named Sam Adams was very opposed to the whole thing. He was a fervent patriot, son of liberty, Massachusetts comes first kind of guy. He's opposed to it. And they had 355 people show up as delegates to the Massachusetts convention. By far, the most of any convention of any of the 13 states. And they were down about 210 to whatever the number was, 145 or so at the start of the convention. And so the head of the convention, a guy named John Hancock, John Hancock's famous signature. Nothing against John, but he was a consummate politician. And John didn't know which way the whole thing was going to go. And so, amazingly, he got a case of gout and he had to stay home. And Sam Adams, who was kind of his partner in crime, not crime, that's not good, but partner, after he was convinced there was going to be a Bill of Rights at some point, not right away, but at some point, went back to John and said, okay, I think we got now more votes than they have. Miraculously, John Hancock rises from his bed, walks into the room and says, okay, now we're going to pass this thing. And he gets all the credit for leading the convention that he never attended. But anyway, that's how it works with politicians. No politicians in here, I hope. No. And that was mild compared to Virginia. Virginia, and by the way, the final vote was, I think, 187 to 177, really close, even after all that. And once you can remember, almost as many people opposed to the Constitution as were in favor of it. Virginia, Virginia was the biggest state in the country. And Virginian in here?
Yes.
Oh, there we go. There you go. Okay, good. And that's right. Also, leading figures in the nation, not just Virginia. Patrick Henry, William Grayson, Richard Henry Lee, signer of the Declaration of Independence, hugely opposed to the Constitution. George Mason, brilliant man, father of our Bill of Rights, all opposed to it. And these guys were fighting back and forth for about 5 weeks. They were finally promised a Bill of Rights at some point. They passed the Constitution. Now we have the Constitution. And And we've had it obviously ever since. And so that's the kind of the journey all the way through our 4 foundational documents. The Articles of Association, Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, and the Constitution. And here's a bit of historic trivia for you. Does anybody know who's the one guy who signed all 4 documents? You get a quarter if you get, oh, in the back. Good man. I thought I was gonna stump you guys. All right. So my material's not as good as it used to be. Okay. Roger Sherman, a quiet man from Connecticut who doesn't get his due, quite honestly. He's a good man. And so we create this federal constitution. We exist under it now 240 some years. And so my question for you is this. The people that were anti-federalists wanted to just revise the Articles of Confederation. And that's all the states wanted them to do. Every state received a packet of instructions when they went to Philadelphia that summer of 1787. That packet said the sole and express purpose of this grouping is to revise the Articles of Confederation. No one had authority to make a new constitution, but they did. Personally, I'm glad they did, but that's not what they were authorized to do. And so there was a lot of pushback on that. So my question is this, you think the founding fathers had this federal behemoth that we now have in front of us in mind when they passed the Constitution? And I don't think so. And so how did we get from these brilliant men creating a constitution, what we have today? And I'm not being critical of it, but I don't think it was what they had envisioned. And I'll just say a couple of things. This is my own personal thing, but it was a combination of something called implied powers and something called an income tax. And we'll talk about that just a bit. What are implied powers? Implied powers we talked about just a bit earlier. It's something that's implied to allow you to do something that's stated. We had enumerated powers given to Congress. You can raise an army. And they put in there, and you can raise any laws necessary and proper to do your stated laws. And no one really thought much about it. He said, okay, fine, that makes sense. And yes, you need to have laws you can't think of at the time. Makes a lot of sense. And we also can't say that it's expressly delegated, because if you do that, you're really tying yourself up and limiting what you can do. So James Madison, a brilliant man, decides this is how it's going to be with the Bill of Rights, with help from George Mason, and really spoke down this word expressly, because he wanted flexibility given to the federal government. Not a big deal until something happens in 1819. And that something is a Supreme Court decision called McCulloch versus Maryland. And if there's any constitutional scholars in here, you'll know that's one of our foundational decisions. It established that because it says necessary and proper, the federal government has implied powers, untold implied powers. Anything that the Supreme Court says they need to make their enumerated powers happen is what they can do. And even that was somewhat innocent until the 16th Amendment, because what's it take to make anything happen? It takes money. Without money, you can't do anything. I don't care if you're an organization or a country or a cheese factory like we had. You have to have money. And so President Lincoln passes an income tax as a war measure. 1862 kind of plants the seed that we can start taxing income. Congress tries to pass a tax in 1889. Supreme Court says you can't do it, unconstitutional. So 1913, they passed the 16th Amendment. The income tax, worst amendment ever, personal opinion, scratch that, I just said that anyway. And so what happens with that, 4 years later, if you think, how does an income tax ever get approved by 2/3 of the Senate and the House and 3/4 of all the states? Who's ever going to approve an income tax? Well, it's because the politicians lied. They said, oh, we're only going after the rich. We're not going to tax anybody but those that make more than $3,000 a year. That was 3% of the population. And then we're going to make them pay their fair share. And then we're gonna go after those greedy corporations, and we're gonna tax them at 1%. We're gonna make them pay their fair share. And that's from the Revenue Act in 1917. Within 3 years, rates are rising, and they're grabbing more and more people. And of course, today, you know what we have for our IRS system. Not saying it's good or bad, but that's what happened. And so how did we get to this behemoth? It's because all of a sudden the federal government had money. And with money came the ability to do what? Borrow. Because people will start believing you can pay it back, which is important. And so because of all that, we've been able to win 2 world wars. But we also went to Vietnam and Korea and Afghanistan and Iraq with no declaration of war, all because we had a strong constitution and money to fund it. We have built the greatest transportation network in the world, and communication network in the world. We're the rival of everyone. That's why so many people want to come here. And we also have $35 trillion in debt because we can borrow money, because we think we can pay it back, but we're not going to. Most of us are going to be well gone before it's ever dealt with. Our children or grandchildren, well, that's a shame. And so that's how that whole thing kind of happens. And so and my question to you is this: if were we better off revising the Articles of Confederation with the Anti-Federalist right? Should we just have tweaked it? We should have thrown the whole thing out like we did and create this new constitution? It's food for thought, and I'd love to get your input on that. What do you guys think?
I'll start. I guess one question that leads to
Go to Mike.
is, during the Revolutionary War, there was a constant struggle to pay the troops, to basically put together the basic supplies and armaments one would need to carry on a war. We had to borrow from France and others to finance the war. What was the case made by the Anti-Federalists in light of that experience as to why some stronger union wasn't required?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I think the Anti-Federalists primarily were concerned about protecting states' rights. That was their big thing. And they worried that with funding, the federal government would supersede the state government. They all saw the problem with the army, funding the army during the Revolution. And it's interesting that most of the major officers in the war sided with the Federalists. And why do you think that was? They were in the army. They saw what a weak central government did. And so I think guys like Patrick Henry recognized the need, but I don't think they saw a need to throw out the Articles of Confederation. I think they wanted to revise them. But more than anything, I think it was because they were just scared about giving up their states' rights. You know, you think about the federal system that we have in this country. The whole idea behind it is you have 50 competing entities. If you want abortion on demand and you want great weather and you don't mind high taxes, California is a great place to be. You can't beat it out there if you like those things. If you want no income tax and a traditional lifestyle and you love country music like Sean and I do, you move to Tennessee. And so that's what those guys are trying to protect. They each wanted their own state to have its own way. They didn't care what happened in Massachusetts, but they felt that the country was too big for one organization in DC, wasn't Washington then, but the nation's capital, to dictate policy for everyone. And you know, think about it, back then, it took weeks to get from Georgia to Massachusetts. I mean, the transportation system was horrendous. And most people consider their state first. And to surrender that to a federal government, they just weren't ready to do that. I don't know if I'm answering your question now, but that's why I think the whole thing happened that way. And so it was still fairly states' right oriented, until the Tax Act, when the federal government had power and money and they started doing other things. You know, interestingly, Thomas Jefferson wasn't at the Constitutional Convention. He was in France. John Adams wasn't there either. John Adams basically ran the Second Continental Congress. He wasn't there. You wonder what would have happened if they had been there. You know, John Adams never sat down. He was a talker. And you wonder what he would have dictated if he had been there. But I think it would have looked very different if they had showed up. I don't know that the states' rights, the loss of the state's power was envisioned by anybody that was there, including the Federalists. So anyway, long answer to your question. Other questions? Yeah.
So, okay, so you've talked about states' rights, federal power, right? So, you can clarify this for me, but I think like the Constitution has the Bill of Rights, which is kind of focused on individual rights. So how is this evolution of individual rights done? You know, like if you say that you want the Articles of Confederation, did that have some protection of individual rights, or did state constitutions have protection of individual rights? But this aspect of individual rights.
That's a great question. Yeah, each state did have their own constitutions, and they had their own bills of rights. It was you're right about that. And so that was the argument against the Bill of Rights. Alexander Hamilton famously said, "You don't need a Bill of Rights. Why do you have to state what's already true? The Constitution simply gives power, and if it's not given, then it doesn't exist." And so the right for free speech, Alexander Hamilton said, it's there. You don't need a Bill of Rights. You don't need freedom of religion. You have it. I mean, so why do you have to say, yes, you have it? We don't have to say you have the freedom to breathe. It's just one of those freedoms of natural rights they had. And so, but that wasn't good enough for like a George Mason or a Patrick Henry. They wanted it enshrined in that federal constitution like they had it at the state level. George Mason was the father of the Declaration of Rights. A lot of that same language flowed through to the federal Bill of Rights. And so that was why, and the Bill of Rights was very much individually oriented. But these guys were so worried about it happening that through the first 8 articles, first 8 amendments, excuse me, they're very much individual rights. The first few are specifically things you can do. The next 3 talk about restricting the federal government. The 9th Amendment states that anything that's not stated is reserved for the people. And then the 10th says anything that's not reserved for the people or the federal government is reserved to the states. But it doesn't say expressly. You know, we talked about that earlier. And that's because Madison wanted flexibility given to the federal government. But that was the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is primarily an individual document, but the 10th Amendment was designed to be a catch-all for rights for the states, where rights were further enshrined. Does that answer the question or not?
Well, what do you think would have happened if we had left it to the states to do individual rights and it's not in the Constitution?
Well, I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know. Hamilton said you didn't need it. George Mason said you did. 2 Americans love the country, very different views. I'm glad they're there personally. You know, it didn't hurt adding them. And so I don't know what would have happened. Any thoughts on that, anyone? Yeah.
Well, yeah, originally, the Bill of Rights applied to the federal, the Bill of Rights applied to the federal government. It didn't expressly apply to the states themselves. You know, it's only via the 14th Amendment that the court should interpret
Corporation.
the Bill of Rights is applying to some of the state action. So, yeah. You know, there's a question before, there was nothing in the Articles of Confederation to preserve individual rights against anything, because there again, I think Madison's view as well as Hamilton's was, you know, you don't need to preserve something that already exists.
Yeah.
And just by mentioning this, you think, well, we mentioned this, what about something else? You know, just because we enumerated these things doesn't mean there are more things, that freedoms that people ought to have, which is why you have, as you said, the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendment.
Thank you. Yes, then.
Yeah, I mean, is it part of the issue? how you're seeing the origin of the rights. It's not what the government gives you, it's a natural right that predates the Constitution. And the amendments are really checks on the usurpation of federal
natural
government,
rights.
natural rights. But at some point, you get it shifted to what FDR calls the four freedoms, which is
Okay.
a very different paradigm. Oh, sorry, the four freedoms is a very different paradigm.
What are the four freedoms? I'm not
What is
familiar with
the
them.
freedom from want, the freedom from fear, which
Oh.
are not negative rights at all. They're things that, how should I put it? Not enshrining natural rights that the government is prohibited from infringing on, but essentially advocating that the government preserves you from fear and from want, which is a very different paradigm where you're locating the rights. Is it from God? Is it
Yeah.
the Declaration of Independence? And you just, it's sort of like, don't even think about parking here. You're saying to the government, don't even think about infringing on the right of free speech or religion or
Okay,
so on. But that's a different way of looking at it, and at a certain point, it shifts to you're being given the rights from the Bill of Rights, which can be extended to the four freedoms, but you're really shifting the way you're looking at rights.
yeah, they're not really being given the rights. We have the rights without the government giving them to us, right? Thank you. Yeah,
Does the order in which those amendments to the Bill of Rights, the order in which they're listed, represent any type of priority or just the chronological order that we're debating?
yeah, the question was, do they represent any sort of priority? I'm gonna be honest, I don't know. I've never read that. There actually were 12 amendments that were proposed at the same time. This all happened pretty quick. Remember the ratification congresses in each state basically were promised that they would propose a Bill of Rights, because where do amendments originate? In Congress. You have to pass 2/3 of the House to get the amendments. And so the very first Congress, first thing they do, talk about a Bill of Rights. 12 are proposed by none other than James Madison, because he was a House Representatives guy at that time. Only 10 were approved. They weren't trying to find a nice round number to remember. 10's a nice number, isn't it? It was not planned that way, it just happened. And but to answer your question, I don't know if they were, there's a sequence to them. You know, the first few talk about really individual things. And then you get into things like the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the Seventh Amendment, where you talk about restricting what the government can do to someone on trial and how they can question them. And so the first ones are really basically freedoms. And the last two are catch-alls, number 9 and number 10. And so I suspect there was some order, but I've never read it. Has anyone read anything about that? That they were done in a certain order? I'll look that up when I get home. I don't know. Thank you. Yeah, in fact,
Sorry, Tom, just want to interrupt.
am I running too long?
We have a couple virtual questions as well, so just want to give you one of those. One person is writing, talking about the availability of information to the delegates back during the constitutional period versus today. Delegates, many of whom only knew their one state, and today people know a lot more information about many other states. Would that have changed if people had the information they did today, what they created back then, and today, with all the knowledge, did that change how we look at the Constitution and central government?
That's an interesting question. Anybody have any thoughts on that? You know, it's interesting. I'm not convinced Wisconsin likes Minnesota or Minnesota likes Wisconsin. I'm not convinced Virginia and Maryland are great pals even today with all the information. So I think we're still pretty regional in our thinking. So I don't know. We certainly would have understood the other side better, perhaps. We wouldn't have been as, I don't say ignorant, but we wouldn't have known. You know, we would have had some of those gaps filled. But I still think that, you know, that people cling to their states and what they live where they want to live in this country because they like that. So they might have, we know things about other states, but I think we live where we want to live. So I'm not convinced it would have changed much. Any thoughts on that? Good.
Anybody else?
You were speaking about amendments earlier, and I think one of the other topics that you brought up was whether or not we should tweak the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah.
I think one of the principal weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation was the amendment process, which required a unanimous vote. And it was easier to replace it with the Constitution than it was to make any changes, which everyone saw as a fundamental weakness to the Articles.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, I love the Constitution, I revere it. I'm glad we have the Constitution, and we're all smarter in hindsight, aren't we? And you look back and you think about the brilliance of Madison and the other guys that helped him. And what geniuses they were, and to be able to craft that in 4 months, did it in 4 months. Hot, steamy Philadelphia, sweltering conditions, and they came together and did all this. These were men that had different viewpoints. They were able to put differences aside and craft this beautiful document, this masterpiece that we have today. But they couldn't see everything. And so they put this amendment process in place. I think if I had to be critical of James Madison for everything, he's a very good man. I think his mentor was Thomas Jefferson. I think he was much brighter than his mentor personally. A really smart guy. But I don't think he realized how much out of control finances could get for our federal government. I don't think he saw that coming. I don't think anyone back then worried about the ballooning debt. They could have put in a balanced budget amendment, not amendment, a balanced budget clause. They didn't. But back then, people spent money differently, and there wasn't the income to do that. So, if anything, I think that most of the problems we have flow from finances. Most problems we have come from a lack of money or too much of it, I guess. And I think it's the only thing to ever find fault with Madison on. But how are you supposed to see everything to that when you're in the moment? And so what he did, I think, is just a beautiful document. But yeah, I'm back.
Just to say, we're coming to the end of the program, so another question
Talking
or
too much,
two,
yeah.
and then we'll have to release you either to dinner or to the rest of the reception. So, Tom, who was you like to call on? Did somebody raise their hand?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
We have 2 New Yorkers and a Virginian who wrote the Federalist Papers.
We do, yes, that's right.
And Alexander Hamilton just coincidentally became Secretary of the Treasury after creating this federal.
Brilliant man, just brilliant.
You want to comment on it?
Well, since John Jay got sick right after he was hired to be one of the 3 writers, and so he only wrote 5 of the Federalist Papers. So everybody here read the Federalist Papers? It's you know what, might be sleeping material to some people, but it's fascinating stuff that these brilliant men wrote. 2 men from New York, 1 from Virginia, and so I think maybe your point was that they are still thinking as one, even in different parts of the country. And aren't we fortunate they did that? Yeah, but if you haven't read that, take some time to at least go through that. Madison's, my favorite part is where he talks about if men were angels, there'd be no need for government. That, I think it's Federalist 51, he talks about that. It's just brilliant. But without men being angels, we have to give the government the power to govern. In the very next instance, force it to govern itself. And what a challenge. Give it power and then trust it with enough self-discipline to discipline itself. That's the hard thing to do. So anyway, 3 brilliant men, 2 Federalists, and as it turned out, 1 anti-Federalist in the sense, Madison. He went over to Jefferson's side, right, at the end. I see you're making your face no,
That's an anomaly. I mean, he's writing in favor of the Constitution,
Yeah.
and he's anti-federalist.
He wasn't then. It's interesting when he, it's 8 o'clock. Do I need to turn this thing off?
You don't have a hard stop and you
Okay.
have a short presentation once you're done, so.
Madison's an interesting guy. He was very much a Federalist until Jefferson came back from France. He very much respected Thomas Jefferson, and I think that influenced him a bit. And I think he saw more of the anti-Federalist argument. He certainly became a Democratic Republican following Jefferson. And so I think he saw a different viewpoint when Jefferson came back. What do you think?
Well, I think that he speaks in terms of a federal government, but one with limited power.
Yeah.
That won't run roughshod on the people and will be tempered by the Constitution, by the judiciary, and by the Congress. You know, they created this whole three
Checks and balances.
checks and balances. Yes, that's what I was
Yeah.
getting to. There'll be checks and balances.
Yeah, it's interesting, it's not a flaw, but it's interesting, who decides all federal issues, all national issues? You know, a federal agency, the Supreme Court, decides the power of the federal government. I mean, it had to be that way. Somebody has to say, it has to be the final authority, but
Supreme Court is not an agency.
I'm sorry, but you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
one of the three branches,
Yeah.
but a federal branch decides the
Yeah.
authority of the federal government.
It's an Article 3.
Yeah, it's almost like having the manager of the Yankees be the umpire in a Yankees Red Sox game. I don't know.
It's got its own article. It's just
It
like
does,
those two
you're right.
things.
You're right about that. Am I taking too long?
Uh,
One last question in the back.
that's fine.
No, oh, yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Just first, I wanted to thank you for the presentation and the
Oh.
thoughtful discussion. It's been very nice. Just to frame the question is that the government was founded initially as a government with, as you said, enumerated powers.
It was.
And unenumerated rights for the people. We've become a government of unenumerated powers and a people of enumerated rights. Now, my understanding is that.
Well said. Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Wish I had said that.
My understanding is, with the Bill of Rights, beyond just do we need it, that there was a counter argument saying that if we list out rights, people in the future might get confused and think because we've listed these, we've enumerated rights in the Bill of Rights, that your rights are enumerated, not unenumerated. I was wondering if you had heard that, or who would raise that objection, or if you could comment on.
You know, honestly, I haven't heard it until tonight, but it's brilliant reason. I think it's a smart line of thought. No, but I'm gonna use that in my next talk. It's very good. Yeah,
The Fifth Amendment is pretty basic.
yeah, it is. That's right.
Yeah.
Good. Anything else before we wrap up? Do you have a question back there, sir?
Just wanted one quick question, which is, would you tell us a little bit about the website?
Oh, well, sure. I love talking about myself. Who doesn't? It's called AmericanaCorner.com. And I tell you what, it's just a hoot. We had a little cheese factory, Shar and I did in Wisconsin, and turned out better than I ever thought it would. And I don't know how it happened, but it did. And so I sold when I was about 58, before I blew it. You know, things go up, things go down, right? And had to find a retirement gig. So I started this little website called Americana Corner. And boy, it's been a ton of fun. And so each Tuesday I put out an 800 or 900 word story. And every Friday we put out about a 2.5 minute or 3 minute video. No one's gonna watch me longer than that, I get it. And so we have nice short things, and we build. The Tuesday's a written narrative. Friday is on YouTube. Love seeing myself on YouTube. Who doesn't want to be a YouTube star, right? And so we do that, and you know, sometimes we get 200,000 views on a video, sometimes 150,000. And so that's the educational part. And then Shar lets me give away our money with something called this grant program, and it's been so rewarding to help early American history organizations like the Sons of the Revolution. I mean, what a great thing to help my country. And I would dream I could be in this position financially to do it. I don't know if I'm a generous guy, but we got, anyway. Charlotte lets me do it. She makes the money. I give it away. It's a great team. And we just love doing this sort of stuff. And so we visit historic sites. We give away about 120 grants a year, something like that. We're doing a fun one at Mount Vernon. You're not supposed to know this yet, but we're gonna fund the first military encampment ever at Mount Vernon. Just on the 12-acre lawn, just past the Bowling Green, if you guys know Mount Vernon at all. And we're gonna have 250,000 students or so and guests each spring come through and see this really cool military encampment, 12 tents, an officer's tent, reenactors. We're gonna do all kinds of fun things there. That's coming up starting in March at Mount Vernon. So if you get a chance, you might want to see that. And now I am babbling too long. So anyway, thanks for asking the question. If you want to follow me, it would be great. But anyway, thanks for asking the question. Oh, that's all I got.
Thank you so much for the talk. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a couple of things before we adjourn. First, Tom's book, as I mentioned, is on sale outside. It's a great book, and if you have an opportunity, pick it up, and Tom will, I'm sure, be willing to sign it. And then
Book number 2 is coming out in the spring. A little plug, a sequel.
secondly, I think, had tried to mail your plaque with your honorable mention
Thank you.
through our book award to you, and there was some snafu, and then we decided we would just keep track of it and give it to you in person. So we're delighted to be doing that. Paul Dietrich, our book award chairman, could not be here tonight, but Scott Dwyer and I would like to present that to you, as well as a certificate of appreciation for your talk tonight.
Thank you.
So, Scott, if you would join me.
Cheese. Thank you. Thank you much.
And we'll pack this up in some suitable
I
form.
just want to say one last thing if I
Sure.
can, and I'll be promised to be brief on this. You know, you guys are really the ones that are doing most of the work, and you guys need to give yourself a round of applause. You know, it's easy to sit in Franklin, Tennessee and write checks. Anybody can do that. We just happen to have the means to do it, but you guys are doing the work. You guys are out here, boots on the ground, making it happen. You know, a building like this in the middle of New York City, that doesn't just happen. People love what they're doing. You guys got to give yourself a lot of credit. So, as I said, we have the easy job, and just so much fun to meet people like you doing this whole grant program. And so I just want to say, thank you. Back to you. That's all I have.
I have a logistical point, but before the logistical point, I'd like to call on Reverend Cullen to come up to give a benediction.
Good and gracious God, all human lives are in your hands, and all the more the lives of nations. We beg you to bless this nation with concord, wisdom, and virtue. Keep us, the people, united in love of liberty and justice. Our nation's constitution, we know, is old, but grant us, in your mercy, that it may endure for countless and perpetual generations. We ask all this in your holy name. Amen.
And then the logistical point is for those of you who are joining us for dinner, we're going to be in the Nichols room tonight, which is on the second floor. I believe that you can take the stairs that we've opened down to the second floor. I believe you can also take the elevator down to the second floor. Finally, if you want to go way out of your way, you can go back through the entrance, down to the ground floor, back to the back of the restaurant, and come up the stairs to the Nichols room. Many of you will remember it as the room where we typically have our summer tavern night. So if you've been to Summer Tavern Night, you know where the Nichols Room is. So again, Tom, thank you so much. This was terrific, and thank all of you for coming. Thank you to our virtual audience as well.
So the stairwell, for dinner is just towards the back. Shelby will guide you down where to go. And the, book signing will happen also, just next door again in the McAtee Gallery. Oh, sorry, the Messick Gallery. Please, if you would like a book from Tom, please, go to the table now. We do want to get him to dinner at a reasonable hour. And, also, if you're just here for the reception continues to go on. We'll be doing so for another 20-30 minutes. So, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Here's gonna insist. Oh, just- It's okay.